February 1945, Iwo Jima. The volcanic island sleeps under a haze of gunpowder and fear. Black sand grips the boots of exhausted Marines as they advance inch by inch toward the invisible enemy. Ahead lies a labyrinth of tunnels. Japanese fortifications carved deep into the rock, where silence hides hundreds of rifles waiting in the dark. The air trembles with tension. Machine gun bursts flicker from unseen holes, cutting down anyone who moves. For hours, no progress, only smoke, screams, and the sound of metal clashing against stone. Then, a new sound, a slow hiss, rising to a roar. A Marine kneels, his heavy tank sloshing behind him. The weapon in his hands spits fire. A stream of liquid flame that surges into the cave like a living beast. In an instant, the darkness erupts into light. The island itself seems to breathe fire. Deep inside, Japanese soldiers shout, stumble, and vanish behind waves of burning fuel. The stone walls glow red, and the air turns to flame. By dawn, the battlefield is silent again, and the Japanese infantry has learned what it means when fire becomes a weapon. By late 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast chessboard of islands, each one a fortress, each battle a miniature apocalypse. The Japanese Empire, once on the offensive, now found itself cornered, forced into a desperate defensive war. From the coral reefs of Tarawa to the jungles of New Guinea, the Allies had begun their long, bloody push toward Japan itself. But this was no ordinary front. Every island was a fortress built by hand. Miles of tunnels, interlocking bunkers, concrete pillboxes, and hidden firing positions. Japanese soldiers, trained in Bushido and national duty, swore never to surrender. 100 million died together, became a mantra whispered in the dark. For the Americans, this presented a new kind of nightmare. Artillery could pound a hill for hours, and still, the enemy would rise from the smoke unharmed. Hand grenades and rifles were useless against the earth itself. Even tanks struggled, their shells bouncing off fortified embrasures carved into volcanic stone. Each advance cost hundreds of lives. Soldiers learned that every coconut grove concealed a sniper, every hill a maze of tunnels. On Tarawa, Marines were stunned to find bunkers still manned after being shelled for 3 straight days. Commanders quickly realized that conventional firepower could not root the Japanese from their underground world. Something more direct, more terrifying, would be needed. The answer came not from new strategy, but from chemistry. The flamethrower, first tested in the Great War, had long been considered too dangerous, too inhumane for regular use. But in the Pacific, it found its grim purpose. Its fuel, a thick mixture of gasoline and napalm, could cling to any surface, burning hotter than anything seen before. At first, only a few men carried them, heavy, awkward tanks strapped to their backs, feeding a short steel nozzle. Their job was suicidal: to walk up to the mouth of a bunker and unleash a jet of flame that reached nearly 50 yards. The effect was instant and absolute. Fire crawled along the ground, seeped into vents, and filled every crevice with roaring heat. Inside, air turned to poison. No defense, no armor, no courage could stop it. But beyond the weapon's destructive power was something else: psychological dominance. The Japanese had prepared for bombs, bullets, and bayonets. They had not prepared for this. Reports from Tarawa and New Guinea described Japanese troops abandoning positions in panic after the first use of flamethrowers. The same soldiers who had sworn to die in place fled screaming from bunkers engulfed in fire. For the first time, American troops saw their enemy hesitate. Still, few understood the full potential of this new weapon. Many commanders treated it as a last resort, a cruel necessity rather than a strategy. That would change soon, as the battles grew bloodier, the terrain harder, and the enemy more determined. In the coming year, the Pacific would transform from a campaign of bullets and steel into one of fire and fear. The flamethrower, once seen as a crude instrument, would evolve into one of the most effective and feared tools in the American arsenal. And for the Japanese defenders, who had built their faith in the strength of earth and stone, that fire would become their greatest nightmare. But these weapons would soon redefine what it meant to assault a fortified position. By 1944, the flamethrower was no longer an experimental device. It had become a specialized tool of war, refined, standardized, and brutally efficient. Early models like the M1 and M1A1 had short range and frequent mechanical failures. But American engineers, learning from bitter experience, developed the M222, a more reliable and deadly evolution. It could project a jet of flaming fuel up to 45 meters, using compressed nitrogen and thickened gasoline that clung to every surface it touched. In the jungles and volcanic ridges of the Pacific, these machines became the infantry's best answer to an invisible enemy. Each flamethrower operator, known simply as Flame Man, carried nearly 70 pounds of fuel and pressure equipment on his back. His life expectancy in combat was short. Japanese gunners quickly learned to target the tanks first, and the man carrying them often knew he was walking into death. Yet despite the danger, volunteers stepped forward. They knew their weapon could do what no rifle or grenade could: end the fight instantly. The tactic was grimly methodical. A squad would advance toward a suspected bunker under covering fire. Once close enough, the flamethrower operator would kneel, aim the nozzle into an opening, and release a torrent of flame. Inside, oxygen vanished, heat reached 1,000 degrees, and all resistance ended within seconds. The results shocked even hardened soldiers. On Tarawa, Marines reported Japanese troops trying to escape their bunkers, only to be cut down by waiting riflemen. On Saipan, entire cave complexes were cleared with just a few bursts of flame. The reports were brutal, but effective. No further resistance from that position. But for the Japanese, who had built their defenses on the belief that earth and honor would protect them, the flamethrower was beyond comprehension. In their culture, fire carried a spiritual meaning. Purification and destruction intertwined. To be burned alive was not just death, it was desecration. Survivors later described the horror, the sudden roar, the unbearable heat, the smell of burning fuel mixed with earth. Some Japanese officers committed suicide rather than face the flame. Others, realizing the hopelessness of defense, ordered banzai charges, desperate, suicidal attempts to die before the fire reached them. On the American side, the weapon also carried a heavy psychological toll. Flame operators returned from battle haunted by what they had seen and what they had done. Many refused to speak of it after the war. One Marine recalled, "You never forget the sound of it, or the smell." Despite the moral weight, the U.S. command could not ignore its effectiveness. By mid-1944, flamethrowers were being mounted on Sherman tanks, transforming them into mobile infernos. The M4A3R3 Zippo, equipped with the Navy's Ronson flame unit, could clear entire ridgelines without risking infantry. On Peleliu, these tank-mounted flamethrowers proved decisive. The island's coral ridges, packed with tunnels and machine guns, were nearly impossible to capture conventionally. But when the Shermans rolled forward, their flames sweeping across the caves, the resistance collapsed in hours. Still, the Japanese learned. They began building even deeper tunnels, with multiple chambers and air vents to resist the fire. By the time the Americans reached Iwo Jima, the Japanese defenses had become the most complex in the Pacific. 11 miles of tunnels, hundreds of bunkers, and an army ready to fight to the last man. And as the Americans prepared their assault on that black volcanic island, every flamethrower, from handheld to tank-mounted, was checked, fueled, and tested. Commanders knew the battle ahead would be like no other. The Japanese believed they could not be dislodged. The Americans believed they could burn through anything. Both were about to be proven right and wrong in ways neither side could have imagined. And when the flamethrowers arrived on Iwo Jima, the Japanese command would finally understand the true power of American fire. War in the Pacific was personal, fought at ranges so close that soldiers could hear each other breathe. In this intimate hell, the flamethrower introduced a new kind of terror. For the American Marines, it was both a savior and a curse. They watched as bullets and grenades failed to break the Japanese defenses, only for a single burst of flame to end the fight instantly. Yet victory came with a haunting cost. The men who carried the weapon, often called flame men, became both feared and pitied among their peers. They fought in pairs. One carried the weapon, the other covered him with a rifle. They moved slowly, exposed, targets for every sniper in range. To the enemy, killing the flame operator was a sacred duty, a way to save hundreds of comrades from the fire. And yet, these men went forward. Many never returned. Those who did spoke little afterward. Flamethrower operators often suffered intense trauma, not only from the danger, but from the horror of what they witnessed. They saw men consumed in seconds, heard the inhuman screams echoing inside sealed bunkers. There was no clean kill, no distance. It was face-to-face annihilation. Some soldiers admitted they felt guilt. Others said they felt nothing, only relief that it was them, not their brothers, who survived. One Marine described it simply: it was them or us, and down there, that's all that mattered. From a tactical standpoint, flamethrowers were never meant for open battle. They were tools, instruments designed for a specific nightmare: clearing bunkers, caves, and fortified tunnels. The U.S. Marines and Army engineers developed systematic methods of attack. Squads would move in carefully choreographed patterns. Riflemen first to suppress, demolition men to breach, then the flame operators to finish the job. Each bunker or cave was treated like a living organism. They called it cooking it out. A single jet of fire, lasting just seconds, could neutralize an entire position. The heat would ignite ammunition, collapse oxygen supplies, and drive defenders out into the open. Once cleared, demolition teams sealed the entrances with TNT to prevent reoccupation. The method was brutal but efficient. On Peleliu, one Marine regiment eliminated over 400 separate Japanese positions in less than 3 weeks using coordinated flamethrower teams. Even Japanese commanders, known for their stoic endurance, began to acknowledge the weapon's effectiveness. Intelligence reports captured from the enemy described flamethrowers as a weapon of absolute terror. In response, the Japanese altered their defensive architecture. Bunkers were redesigned with inner chambers, angled corridors, and hidden vents to deflect flames. Some troops even dug escape tunnels specifically to flee once the flame appeared. But the Americans adapted faster. They began combining flamethrowers with Sherman tanks and demolition units, turning slow bunker-clearing missions into rapid, synchronized strikes. These combined arms assaults became the foundation of Pacific siege tactics through 1945. The flamethrower had changed the rhythm of war, from days of static bombardment to minutes of decisive fire. Behind the chaos of the battlefield was cold, engineering precision. The standard American M22 flamethrower consisted of 3 tanks, 2 for fuel and 1 for compressed gas. The mixture, gasoline thickened with napalm powder, burned at over 1,000 degrees, enough to melt steel doors and consume an entire cave's oxygen within seconds. A small ignition coil at the nozzle sparked the stream into flame. Each burst lasted 2 to 3 seconds, and an operator carried enough fuel for roughly 10 shots. Every second mattered. Too close, and the heat would backflash. too far, and the flame would dissipate. In the hands of a trained Marine, it became a scalpel made of fire. But engineers didn't stop there. The U.S. Navy and Seabees began adapting flamethrowers to M4 Sherman tanks, replacing the main gun with pressurized flame units, capable of firing continuous streams for up to 150 yards. These modified tanks, nicknamed Zippos after the cigarette lighters, brought the weapon's psychological impact to an industrial scale. They could clear entire ridgelines, purge tunnel systems, and demoralize defenders long before infantry advanced. On Okinawa, Marines reported that the sight of a single flame tank was sometimes enough to cause mass desertions from enemy positions. The Japanese knew there was no defense, no countermeasure, no escape. Technically, the flamethrower was simple. Emotionally, it was apocalyptic. It combined science and terror into one device, a symbol of how far human innovation would go to conquer the unconquerable. And yet, even with all its destructive brilliance, the weapon's power was only as strong as the men who carried it. But technology alone doesn't win wars. Leadership and resolve determine how it's used. War is shaped by decisions, and few decisions came heavier than the one to unleash fire on human beings. For the American High Command, the Pacific Campaign was an equation of distance, attrition, and time. Every mile of coral, every volcanic ridge captured meant fewer soldiers lost in the eventual invasion of Japan. Yet every inch was defended to the death. Generals like Holland M. Smith, the father of amphibious warfare, and Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger understood that conventional assaults were draining lives at unsustainable rates. The Japanese fought from an invisible world, underground, fortified, and waiting. Artillery could destroy the surface, but not the tunnels beneath. So, the solution came in fire. Smith authorized the widespread use of flamethrowers as part of assault doctrine, not merely support. Units were trained to integrate flame teams alongside riflemen, engineers, and tanks. The results were immediate. Faster breakthroughs, fewer counterattacks, reduced casualties in prolonged sieges. To these leaders, the moral cost was secondary to survival. Every day saved by fire meant fewer American graves dug into foreign soil. But among lower-ranking officers, there was unease. Many knew what the weapon did, how it killed, how it erased everything it touched. For them, it was not just a tactical decision. It was a psychological burden that would follow them long after the war ended. Still, leadership demanded results, not sentiment, and the results were undeniable. Fire could do what steel could not, break the will of the enemy. To the Japanese defenders, the appearance of the flamethrower was more than a tactical shock. It was a spiritual one. In the Bushido Code, death in battle was sacred. Soldiers were taught to embrace it with pride, to die honorably rather than surrender. The samurai ideal still burned within the imperial army. Courage, sacrifice, purity of death. But the flamethrower shattered that belief. Inside bunkers and tunnels, there was no glory, only heat, smoke, and screams. The very environment the Japanese believed would grant them invincibility became their tomb. Accounts from survivors tell of soldiers praying, writing final notes, or committing suicide the moment they heard the hiss of flame approaching. One Japanese lieutenant wrote in his diary on Saipan, "We feared nothing until the fire came." The weapon stripped away centuries of martial confidence. It did not just destroy bodies, it destroyed meaning. The Imperial Command tried to adapt, redesigning defenses, drilling emergency escapes, and encouraging banzai charges when flames appeared. But these measures only delayed the inevitable. The American advance had found its ultimate psychological weapon. The once proud defenders who had fought to the death on Guadalcanal now faced a force that burned through stone itself. Japanese reports recovered after the war. Flamethrowers were described as inhuman, unstoppable, and unanswerable. The shock was complete, not just militarily, but culturally. Even among the victors, the flame left deep scars. By 1945, American soldiers had grown accustomed to destruction. Artillery, bombs, naval guns. But the flamethrower was different. It demanded closeness. It made the act of killing direct, personal, and unforgettable. War correspondents and chaplains began questioning its use. Was it necessary? Was it just? Could civilization justify such a weapon? Military officials defended it firmly. It saves lives. And tactically, they were right. Each bunker cleared by flame meant fewer Americans dying in frontal assaults. Yet in the silence that followed battle, many soldiers felt a lingering unease. One Marine chaplain wrote after Okinawa, "You could hear the fire for miles. You couldn't pray it away. You couldn't unsee what it did." The moral debate outlasted the war itself. By the 1950s, as images and testimonies emerged from the Pacific, the public began to question the humanity of flame weapons. Eventually, international conventions would restrict their use, not because they were ineffective, but because they were too effective, too cruel. The flame had proven both the power and the horror of human innovation. It showed how far man would go, and how close he could come to losing his soul in pursuit of victory. Yet within that moral darkness lay one undeniable truth. The flamethrower had broken the unbreakable. It had forced surrender where none was expected, ended resistance where death was once certain. It had done what no bomb or bullet could. It had conquered will itself, and all these forces would collide in one of the Pacific War's most terrifying battles, Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. The island rose from the Pacific like a scar. 8 square miles of volcanic ash, sulfur vents, and iron-hard rock. To the Marines landing on its beaches, it felt alive. The ground burning beneath their boots, the air thick with the smell of cordite and death. The Japanese, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurebayashi, had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress unlike any the Americans had faced. 11 miles of tunnels connected 1,500 caves, pillboxes, and underground chambers. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were hidden beneath the surface, invisible to naval bombardment. For 72 days before the landing, American battleships and aircraft had rained destruction on the island. 22,000 tons of bombs, 70,000 shells. When the Marines came ashore, they expected ruins. Instead, the island erupted in fire. Kurebayashi's men had waited in silence through the bombardment, emerging only when the Americans were fully committed to the beach. Then they opened fire from every direction. From the cliffs, from beneath the ground, from the black volcanic slopes that swallowed bullets and men alike. For hours, progress stalled. Each hill became a fortress, each bunker a grave. Marines huddled behind dead comrades for cover, their rifles useless against hidden embrasures. And then came the order. Bring up the flamethrowers! The first flame teams moved forward under covering fire. They advanced slowly, crawling through ash and smoke, tanks strapped to their backs. The moment the nozzle appeared, enemy snipers zeroed in. Many flame operators never made it halfway. But those who reached the bunkers changed the battlefield instantly. A single burst of fire swept through the darkness, turning the air itself into a weapon. The tunnels that had once offered safety became traps of molten heat. Marines reported hearing the muffled screams from within as the flames filled every corner. In the words of one survivor, the caves burned like ovens. Nothing came out alive. The Japanese fought back with everything they had: grenades, bayonets, even suicidal rushes from burning positions. Yet, for every counterattack, the flame returned stronger, more precise. The M4 Sherman Zippo tanks soon joined the assault. Moving in coordinated lines, they fired arcs of flame across the ridges, sweeping the entrances of caves before sealing them with explosives. The combination was devastating. Entire sectors were cleared in minutes, where days of bombardment had failed. Still, the cost was unbearable. Every yard gained was paid in blood. Marines fell under sniper fire. Flame operators burned alive when their tanks were hit. Medics died trying to drag them to safety. But they pushed on. Not because they wanted to, but because there was no other way. As the Americans advanced north toward Mount Suribachi, they discovered the true complexity of the Japanese defense. Every captured bunker led to another tunnel, another hidden passage, another ambush. The battle became a deadly rhythm. Find the opening, cover fire, flame it out, move on. Hour after hour, the island glowed with the light of burning fuel. The Marines described it as fighting inside a furnace. No shade, no silence, only smoke, heat, and death. Kuribayashi's soldiers refused to surrender. Even when surrounded, they fought from within the fire, their final cries echoing through the tunnels long after the flames died out. By the fifth day, American forces had captured Mount Suribachi, the famous flag raised on its summit. But the island was far from secured. The main Japanese garrison, nearly 18,000 strong, was still entrenched in the north, beneath miles of interconnected caves. And it was there that the true nightmare began. The Japanese had learned from the earlier island battles. They no longer launched suicidal banzai charges. They waited, hidden, patient. Every step forward was a fight into darkness. Every cave demanded another tank of fuel, another burst of flame. The flamethrowers roared day and night, illuminating the black slopes like lightning. The island was burning, not in chaos, but in deliberate, methodical destruction. Inside their tunnels, the Japanese soldiers heard the approach. That unmistakable hiss, the breath of death itself. And they knew what came next. But the most terrifying part was not what the Americans saw. It was what the Japanese heard from inside. Inside the tunnels of Iwo Jima, there was no day and night, only the hum of generators, the smell of sweat, oil, and fear. The men of the Imperial Japanese Army waited in the dark, their faces blackened with soot, their rifles resting against volcanic walls slick with condensation. For weeks, they had heard the thunder above, bombs, shells, tanks, but nothing compared to the sound that now approached. A low hiss, a pulse. Then the roar of flame. It began at one end of the tunnel system, a rush of heat that devoured oxygen faster than men could breathe. The soldiers near the entrances never had a chance. Fire poured in, crawling along the ceiling like a living creature, consuming everything in its path. They screamed, their uniforms igniting, their skin searing before they could even raise their weapons. Those deeper inside tried to retreat, but the tunnels were narrow, twisting. Escape was impossible. In moments, the temperature rose past the limits of survival. Metal melted. Ammunition cooked off. The air itself turned to poison. And still, they fought. One officer, his face burned and bleeding, shouted to his men to seal the passage behind them. They did, piling sandbags, crates, even their own dead to block the flames. But it was too late. The heat seeped through stone. The oxygen vanished. The fire followed. In one underground chamber, a group of Japanese soldiers huddled in silence. They could hear the flamethrowers outside. Bursts of death sweeping the hills one by one. Each roar came closer. One of them began to hum a song, the Umi Yukaba, an ancient military hymn about dying for the emperor. Others joined in, their voices trembling through the smoke. When the flame reached them, the song stopped mid-verse. Outside, the Marines moved on. They had learned not to linger. The tunnels burned for hours, sometimes days, glowing faintly through the ground like veins of molten rock. From above, the island seemed to breathe, pillars of black smoke twisting into the sky, the earth cracking open under the pressure of buried explosions. The air was so thick with ash that the horizon disappeared. The Pacific itself looked gray. For the Marines, survival became mechanical. Eat, burn, move forward. The sound of flamethrowers replaced conversation. The smell of burned fuel replaced food. Many of them would later admit they pitied no one. They couldn't afford to, but deep inside, some remembered what they saw after the flames died. Bodies fused together in the tunnels. Rifles warped from heat. Helmets melted onto skulls. They began to understand what kind of war this had become. Not one of soldiers and honor, but of annihilation. On the 6th day, the Americans discovered a tunnel complex larger than anything before. It stretched hundreds of meters beneath the surface. A command center, hospital, and barracks all in one. When they cleared the entrance, they found dozens of wounded Japanese soldiers lying on stretchers. None moved. They had chosen death over surrender. Grenades clutched in their hands, the pins already pulled. The medics turned away. The next moment, the tunnel erupted. The blast tore through the hillside, scattering rock and fire into the air. Even the Sherman tanks, thick-skinned and heavy, shuddered from the force. As dusk fell, Mount Suribachi glowed like a dying furnace. The Marines, exhausted and filthy, dug in for the night. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly at the horizon. They knew tomorrow would be the same. More tunnels, more fire, more death. For the Japanese, there was no tomorrow. Kuribayashi had forbidden banzai charges, knowing they wasted lives. Instead, he ordered his men to fight to the last breath, to make every inch of the island bleed before surrendering it. He himself moved from bunker to bunker, radio in hand, his uniform covered in dust, refusing to leave his men even as his command post came under direct assault. By the 12th day, most of his officers were dead. The tunnels were collapsing. The air was gone. Yet he still sent coded messages to Tokyo. Short, grim reports written with the precision of a dying man. The enemy is using flamethrowers effectively. Our casualties are heavy, but our spirits remain unbroken. Outside, the Marines no longer saw soldiers. Only shadows in the smoke, flashes of movement before the next burst of fire. The island that once echoed with battle now groaned under the weight of death. And as the last tunnels burned, Iwo Jima itself seemed to vanish into the haze. A black scar in the Pacific, carved forever into the memory of all who fought there. By the end, the fire had consumed not just the island, but everything human that once existed upon it. When the battle for Iwo Jima finally fell silent in March 1945, the island looked less like land and more like a wound. The once black volcanic ridges had turned white with ash. Smoke still drifted from cracks in the ground, rising from tunnels that continued to burn weeks after the fighting ended. The U.S. Marines, who had landed 36 days earlier, stood victorious, but at a terrible cost. Out of the 70,000 men who fought, nearly 26,000 had been killed or wounded. Entire platoons had been erased in single bursts of machine gun fire or flame. The price of every yard of ground had been measured in blood. And the Japanese, they had been almost completely destroyed. Out of roughly 21,000 defenders, fewer than 300 were taken alive. The rest had fought to the death, burned in their bunkers, buried in collapsed tunnels, or fallen in suicidal counterattacks when the fire left them no choice. When Marine patrols finally entered the deeper tunnels, they found what the flamethrowers had done. Charred rifles, scorched uniforms fused to stone, and sometimes, hauntingly, silhouettes of bodies pressed against the walls, burned so fast their outlines were left behind like shadows of Hiroshima yet to come. The engineers who cleared the bunkers wore gas masks, not for poison gas, but for the stench of cooked air and fuel. One Marine officer wrote in his journal, "It was like walking through the mouth of hell." The tunnels still smoked, and the walls bled black oil. Those words, later published in a 1946 report, became one of the earliest human records describing what flamethrower warfare felt like. For the survivors, the memory of those days never faded. Many Marines confessed that the sound of a lighter or the smell of gasoline years later brought them straight back to the island. Some could still hear the screams from the caves in their sleep. Yet, tactically, the weapon had done what nothing else could. Artillery had failed to reach the Japanese underground strongholds. Bombers had only scarred the surface. But the flamethrower, crude and horrifying, became the one thing that could reach where bullets could not. It turned every cave, every bunker, every hidden room into a furnace. And that, ultimately, broke the Japanese defense. In the days after victory was declared, military analysts began documenting what they had witnessed. A U.S. Army report, dated March 1920, dated 1945, concluded, "Flamethrowers were decisive in reducing enemy fortifications on Iwo Jima. No other weapon proved as effective against subterranean resistance." But there was a darker note, too, one that would echo through the rest of the war. The same report ended with a single line that revealed the moral cost of victory. The psychological impact upon the operator and observer is severe. Those who used the weapon rarely spoke about it again. Meanwhile, in Japan, the news of Iwo Jima's fall spread like wildfire. It was the first time the emperor's soldiers had failed to defend sacred Japanese soil. A symbol of invincibility turned to ash. Newspapers announced the battle as a heroic last stand, omitting the detail of how most had died. The truth, that the fire had reached every corner of the island, was buried under silence. But within the imperial command, the implications were clear. If a single small island had required 21,000 men and months of preparation to defend, and still fell, then what would happen when the fire reached the Japanese mainland itself? That realization began to shape the final phase of the war. Military engineers in Tokyo started redesigning bunkers, digging deeper, and studying ways to resist flamethrowers. Civilians were trained to fight in underground shelters, even to turn their homes into fire traps for the invader. Yet, deep down, everyone understood nothing could stop fire. As spring turned to summer, the same flames that had devoured Iwo Jima would soon sweep across Japan's cities, from Tokyo to Osaka, and finally Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The island had been a warning, and no one had listened. In the months following the fall of Iwo Jima, the lessons burned into that volcanic island spread far beyond its shores. The U.S. military analyzed every engagement, every weapon used, every tactic that worked. What they found was simple, but devastating. The flamethrower was no longer just a tool of engineers. It was a psychological weapon, one that could break even the most disciplined army. Reports from Marine divisions described how Japanese soldiers, once known for their unyielding courage, began abandoning caves at the mere sight of a flamethrower operator approaching. The weapon created terror deeper than bullets could reach. It was not only lethal, it was absolute, and so production increased. By the summer of 1945, the United States had built over 30,000 flamethrowers, both portable and vehicle-mounted. The most fearsome among them, the M4A3R3 Zippo Sherman, carried hundreds of gallons of burning fuel, capable of spewing fire over 150 yards. Entire platoons were reorganized around these machines, with engineers and infantry trained to protect the operators at all costs. But even as they perfected the art of fire, the men who used it felt the moral weight. Letters home rarely mentioned the weapon. In private diaries, Words like necessary evil or inhuman but effective appeared again and again. One Marine corporal wrote, "I stopped seeing them as men when I pulled the trigger. You have to. If you don't, you'll never sleep again." For the Japanese command, the aftermath was even darker. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the commander of Iwo Jima, was never found. His body was believed to be buried beneath the tunnels, consumed by the same flames that destroyed his army. His last message to Tokyo read, "The battle is nearing its end. I have fought bravely with my officers and men, and I will not see defeat." Tokyo's response was silence. The emperor's inner circle already knew that Japan could no longer defend itself conventionally. If an island defended by 21,000 tulst, men could be burned to dust in 5 weeks. Then, no amount of honor or sacrifice would stop what was coming next. And what came next was fire on a scale the world had never seen. In March 1945, just days after Iwo Jima was declared secure, American B-29s unleashed a new form of destruction upon Tokyo. Hundreds of bombers dropped napalm and incendiary clusters, transforming the capital into an ocean of flame. Within hours, 100,000 civilians were dead, more than Hiroshima would later claim. The same principle that had cleared the tunnels of Iwo Jima now erased entire cities. The strategy had evolved, but the philosophy remained the same. If the enemy hides, burn him out. In this way, Iwo Jima became both a tactical triumph and a moral scar. The Marines who fought there learned how effective fire could be. The world learned what it cost to use it. Years later, historians would look back at the photographs, the blackened bunkers, the twisted steel, the barren island, and recognize Iwo Jima as the moment when modern war crossed a line. No longer was victory about capturing ground or breaking armies. It became about annihilation, the destruction of will, spirit, and even humanity itself. The flames that burned underground on Iwo Jima would rise again, over the skies of Tokyo, and later in the blinding light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the war finally ended in August 1945, survivors from both sides carried the same memories, not of glory, not of triumph, but of fire. In post-war interviews, a Marine lieutenant who had fought at Iwo Jima was asked what he remembered most vividly. He paused for a long time, then said quietly, "It wasn't the fighting. It was the smell of the island. It never left me." And when Japanese veterans were asked what they feared most during the Pacific War, they didn't say artillery or tanks. They said one word: fire. When the fires of Iwo Jima faded, the world entered a silence unlike any before. The smoke that had risen from that tiny volcanic island drifted into history. Invisible, but permanent. War had always been brutal, but Iwo Jima revealed something deeper: humanity's willingness to turn the elements themselves into weapons. In those tunnels, men did not just fight. They vanished inside a storm of their own creation. The line between survival and destruction blurred, until neither side could tell which one they stood on. The flamethrower was a simple machine, a tank, a hose, and a spark, but it carried an ancient terror. Fire had once meant warmth, life, protection. Now it meant the end of everything. And on that island, surrounded by black sand and endless ocean, both the Marines and the Japanese soldiers discovered what it truly meant to face that element unleashed. For the victors, Iwo Jima became a symbol of endurance, a necessary step toward ending the war. For the defeated, it became a grave that swallowed their courage and their hope. But for history, it stood as a warning that once war reaches the level of fire, there is no humanity left to save. The ashes of Iwo Jima would soon mix with those of Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, one continuous chain of flame stretching across the Pacific. And when peace finally returned, it did not come with celebration, but with silence. the silence of men who had seen too much. In the end, Iwo Jima was not just a battle for territory. It was a confrontation with the darkest part of human invention, the moment when technology outgrew mercy. As one veteran later said, staring at the photograph of a flamethrower erupting against the rocks, "We thought we were fighting the enemy, but in that fire we were fighting ourselves."